Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Alexander Arefiev. I'm press attaché of the Russian Embassy in South Africa, and this is Alternative Viewpoint video series. Let us start this episode with just one expression. Nothing ever lasts forever. Yet with time, we reaffirm the view that the US and EU are forgetting this simple wisdom as the conflict between Russia and the West, where Kiev regime acts merely as the latter's proxy, unfolds. Why is that? You see, the West evidently placed its bid on Russia's total military defeat in Ukraine. To illustrate what we're saying, here are some quotes. Lloyd Austin, US Secretary of Defense. We believe that they, Kiev regime, can win if they have the right equipment, the right support, and we're going to continue to do everything we can to ensure that it gets there. John Kirby, the then Press Secretary of Pentagon. We want to see Mr. Putin and the Russian army lose this fight inside Ukraine. Some of the EU officials spoke to similar tone. Joseph Borrell, EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. This war, Russian-Ukrainian conflict, will be won on the battlefield. And another quote of Belgium's Prime Minister Alexander De Croo. It is very important that we continue to talk to him, Ukraine's President Zelensky, emphasizing that war can only be won on the battlefield and that we must continue to support President Zelensky and the people of Ukraine to win on the battlefield. Finally, Jens Stoltenberg, NATO's Secretary General. Our focus is to support them, Ukrainians, on the battlefield with many different types of lethal and non-lethal support. And we're not even talking about how irresponsible and immature, to say the least, the statements in the vein of Putin must not be allowed to win in Ukraine are. Just have a look. The war in Ukraine is the most dangerous moment for Europe since World War II, and Russia must not be allowed to win, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said. What does this must not be allowed even mean? That NATO does not give Russia its permission to win? That it imposes a ban on Russia's victory? Look what the sanctions frenzy can bring you to. Anyway, judging by these quotes, and we are far from running out of similar statements by other Western officials, one cannot escape the conclusion that Russia's military defeat is the only acceptable outcome for the West. Yet the situation on the front line is evolving in a way which is far from collective West's wishes. Russia has the advantage, while the Western-controlled mainstream media are trying their hardest to pretend that it hasn't. A question arises. Why do the elites of the collective West act as if they are sure that there will be no Russia to deal with tomorrow? It is against this background that we would like to explore the following topic. Is it time to talk about the endgame in Ukraine? And moreover, what comes after the game ends? We have already discussed it in the previous episode of Alternative Viewpoint, but the canceling of Russian culture initiated by the West serves the same purpose. To convince the international community that Russia is gone, it has fallen victim of the West's ire and thus must be left in the oblivion. Such line of conduct reminds that of a small child who covers the face with palms to pretend that all the things this child is afraid of or dislikes simply do not exist anymore. The facts, however, suggest the exact opposite. Of course, Russia feels the pinch of Western sanctions, but these very sanctions backfired at the West itself and echoed across the globe, contributing to skyrocketing prices and disruption of supply lines. The West has evidently been burning bridges with Russia without making a secret of it, yet as time goes on, it becomes more and more evident that Russia is not going anywhere from planet Earth. So, here's a curious question in this regard. What the West is going to do with all its Russophobia and blatant racism towards Russians? Western leaders and diplomats have laughed off Russia's last-minute diplomatic proposals aimed at initiating talks on crucial security issues of mutual, as we thought, interest. They violated all possible trade and financial agreements not only with Russian state but also with Russian private entities, They made a mockery of such principles of impartiality in sports in particular, political correctness, freedom of expression, inviolability of private property, tolerance, and many others that defined, according to Western propaganda, the so-called enlightened West. How are they going to walk out from it? Do the Western elites honestly think that after all this anti-Russian hysteria, all the inhuman, absurd, and let alone illegal steps, Russia will just shrug it off and get back to business as usual? That after seeing how its citizens were demonized, assaulted, and insulted in numerous countries of Europe just on the basis of their nationality, Russia itself will greet EU with a welcoming embrace? We doubt that very much, especially when several countries of EU are banning visas for Russians, again, solely because of their citizenship. This is a reincarnation of Iron Curtain. The West is building yet another Iron Curtain, just like it did after World War II. As a quick guided tour in history, we remind our distinguished audience that the Cold War started in 1946 after UK Prime Minister Winston Churchill's Fulton speech. He even coined the very term Iron Curtain. Russia has already concluded that West cannot be trusted. And the West did everything it could to reaffirm that view for the rest of the world. Yet the Westerners themselves are evidently trying to bend the reality. On the one hand, they realize, we hope, that Russia's and Europe's destinies are linked due to their geographical proximity, as well as cultural, historical, and trade ties, which turned out to be harder to sever than EU expected. On the other hand, they keep pursuing the line of Russia's so-called isolation. And that is despite obvious deterioration of the living standards in Europe, which is due, of course, to a number of factors, of which the boomerang effect of the Western sanctions imposed on Russia is not the smallest one. It's not just about high prices. It turned out that some volumes of the commodities supplied to Europe by Russia that the Europeans took for granted, honestly speaking, simply cannot be substituted from other sources. So, the relaxing comfort for European population that the Western propaganda ascribed to ideology of democracy as essential condition of development, in reality was partially a result of beneficial cooperation with Russia. More and more people in the West slowly but steadily realize that Russia is still out there, it's not going anywhere, it matters, and sooner or later they will have to face the dilemma of rebuilding the relations. But how? After all the damage that has been done to those relations. The West probably expected Russia to end up in a position of a subordinate, so that the former could talk down to the latter. Seemingly, the US and EU were so confident that this scenario will come to life that they didn't even come up with a backup plan. Hence the logical contradiction we described above. As for the situation in Ukraine, it fully mirrors what we have described on the grand scheme of things. On the one hand, the US, the self-proclaimed leader of the Western world, says the fight must go on. Here is a quote from US Senator Lindsey Graham.
I like the structural path we're on here. As long as we help Ukraine with the weapons they need and the economic support, they will fight to the last person.
This is exactly what many political commentators have been saying for many years. Americans will fight Russia till the last Ukrainian soldier. On the other hand, however, EU hints at possible resolution of the conflict. France's Macron says up to Ukraine to decide on potential territorial concessions. That's what Reuters said. So much for the Western unity, by the way. Sometimes the US says one thing, the EU the exact opposite. Such state of affairs emerged from the fact that the West put all the chips on one bet and now desperately trying to, metaphorically speaking, rewind the time and replay the entire match. While trapped into this double thing, the West is seeking to influence the military situation in Ukraine, which is not under its control at all. We can give our viewers the most general outline of what the endgame in Ukraine will look like. We're not talking about some of the most obvious things like restoration of some 300 billion US dollars of stolen Russian assets, etc. The key point here is that the West will have to take Russian security interests in full account. In part, they were formulated in Russian security proposals of December 2021 and Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov's letter on the matters of indivisible security dated January 2022. Remember, those most thoroughly worded and balanced proposals were arrogantly rejected by the West. All this Western support to Ukraine, both military and financial, serves no other purpose but to prolong the conflict, to weaken Russia. The thing is, the higher they make the costs for us, the tougher our terms would be for them. All the while, we can already see the vague image of tomorrow. A new multipolar world order emerges. That is all for today. My name is Alexander Arefiev. I am press attaché of the Russian Embassy in South Africa, and this was Alternative Viewpoint video series. Stay tuned, stay safe.